Welcome to New Testament Survey, Lesson 2. In the introduction of New Testament Survey, we talked a little bit about the structure of the New Testament and particularly the gospel messages. We looked at the sections between the historical books, the epistles, and the apocalyptic literature. We're in New Testament Survey 1 studying the historical books, which is principally the Gospels and the book of Acts. So we're looking at historical accounts or what we view them to be as historical accounts. We said that one way to look at the New Testament organization is the Gospels and Acts are records about the event. The epistles are letters and discussion about what the event meant. And Revelation tells us about the next event. Okay, so there's an element of timing in that. If you look at the historical record, they're trying to write down what occurred. Paul and the writers of the epistles are going to discuss what that meant, right? So they're looking back at the event and then trying to understand what does that mean? How does it apply to our lives? Ultimately, John's going to discuss in Revelation not only the event and what it means, but what it means coming next. So a couple questions that we might want to wrestle with, one of which is there's a whole field of study that we really tonight don't have time to get into, but a field of study called textual criticism. Okay, so the very, 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 very short version of textual criticism. In the move out of maybe what's considered the Dark Ages into the period of modernism, there's this explosion in science and learning and human knowledge. And there's actually a return to writings of antiquity. And the writings of antiquity would be like Greek classic literature and other scriptures, one of them. And in that movement back towards looking at historical literature, say from the 1700s on, maybe as early as the 1500s, but say from the 1700s on, in that study of looking at historical literature, we're talking about documents that are, in the case of the New Testament, would be 1700 years old, but Greek literature even before that. And so you're looking at documents that are thousands of years old. In that study, one of the things that was noted or questioned was the reliability of those texts. So how do we know how do we know that what the authors wrote are what we're reading today? That is a question. We tackled some of this. We tackled the questions in systematic theology and bibliology. We tackled it in other areas in terms of the reliability of Scripture. And in fact, in one of the things that we looked at in Lesson 1 was a video that discussed the reliability of the New Testament survey. And the conclusion of that discussion really is the reliability of the copying of the transmission is very good. Okay, so another way to attack or to look at the questions on New Testament survey is, well, aren't I reading the same account, right? Don't they all seem pretty familiar? I mean, if you look at Matthew and Mark and Luke's testimony of the events, 93% of Mark's gospel can be found in the other three gospels. So that's only 30 verses or so that are unique to Mark. Did one copy another? Did one copy and then the other copy the two other copies? And if so, do we have one account of an event and then multiple copies from other authors? Or do we have separate accounts? And so that's a question that we have before us that we want to take a look at. Well, there are theories on this. Here are the prevailing theories. There's a theory of oral tradition. Oral tradition, which is common in Jewish culture, was a source for the writers. So, and this is true, in fact, because today it's hard for us to imagine that things that we need to remember, we'd have to actually remember. So, before paper and computers and electronic records, the way things were remembered is they were memorized. They were repeated and told over and over and over again, so much so, not like today, not like we would think of it, because we have the reliance really on recording devices. So because of that, our memories aren't how they were here. But oral tradition would be a central part. It would be more central than, say, reading, because books didn't exist. It would be more central than computers, because computers didn't exist. So oral tradition was central to the way you would pass down information. So for example, in the case of the Gospels, perhaps they were just passed down by memory, repeated over and over again. That's a possibility. Another possibility is fragmentary theory, where writers drew from multiple written sources. Here's a question for you. I promise you I don't have the answer, but I love asking this question. If you're following Jesus and you're seeing all of these things occur, I don't know about you, but I'm taking notes. Like at the end of the day, I'm going back to my tent, I guess. Maybe no tent, maybe out under the stars. And I'm laying there, I'm going, he fed, there were 5,000. And he two loaves and 5 fish. And wait, we fed 5,000 people and all we had was a couple loaves and a couple fishes. I might make a note of that if I had paper and if I had a pen. If particularly it was my job to write them down. And so the question really is, was there a documentation process? We don't get the answer on that from Scripture. Textual criticism attacks the question of how there's preservation of the story. And the reason why textual criticism does that is they're looking at the study, the field of looking critically at the text is to understand what was real in the text and what wasn't. Okay, so it's not something to shy away from. There's actually real benefit to textual criticism. But there was a period of time where textual criticism looked at the scriptures to the point where it said none of it was real. None of it was reliable. And this is where kind of God's sense of humor comes in, because he often then provides additional evidence that was perhaps missing in the 17 and 1800s, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the findings of at Qumran. And so you suddenly have this whole other bits of information that show maybe you guys didn't have it quite right, that the scriptures weren't recorded like you thought they were or the way you supposed they were. So one theory is fragmentary theory, where there are just fragments of sources and Mark's taking a little bit of those notes and Matthew's working off of the same of those notes. We're going to come back to that in a second. There's a 2-document theory and then there's a 4-document theory, and different theologians over time subscribe to one or the other or both or none. One in 2-document theory is Mark was the first gospel written, so it, along with the second source called Q or Quell in German, was used by Matthew and Luke. So 2 documents, Matthew and Luke used those documents to write their gospels. That's why we have such consistency in the gospels. That's why the phraseology and the recording of the events are similar. Okay, so there's a theory on that. The other theory is 4-document theory, which is 4 independent sources used in writing the other Gospels. Mark's, Q, M, which is a private source for Matthew, and L, which is a private source for Luke. These are real theories. I'm not making them up. And the reason why, and I'm not making fun of them either, they're looked at linguistically in the text and say, okay, that's different textually than how Luke would be writing. So for example, if you were writing a letter, and then right in the middle of the letter, Stu, the way that you wrote, there was a phrase that you used that was totally not Stu. It was like something, you reverted to old King's English. And then you reverted back to the way you would normally write. Somebody who found the letter later on would go, yeah, that's Stu. That's not Stu. That's Stu. And so the looking at the text critically can determine maybe there were times when either there was a document used as a source or there was myth that creeped in later. Somebody else inserted it later. There's a problem with it being inserted later. I'll walk through that in a second. So the question was, did the gospel writers use a source? And unfortunately, we're not going to know the answer to that. This is actually theologically a big area of debate. Most believe yes, because they find it hard to believe that there would be three separate writings that would have such consistency to them that they could all be independent of one another, written at separate times and separate places. Okay, so I offer a simple theory on that, a simple explanation on that. If we were to watch an event, actually studies have been done on this. If we were to watch an event, all of us were to watch an event. And actually the way the studies usually happen is there's a classroom, somebody runs into the classroom, does something, runs out of the classroom, and then you're asked to write what you saw. Okay? So you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 perspectives on the event. If we were to all write what we saw, in those 10 perspectives, there would be a high number of common elements. Somebody ran in, that person did something, they ran out. Those might be the common elements. Okay? So of the 10 perspectives, we would have, generally speaking, agreement on certain major events. But here's where it gets interesting. Now when we go one layer lower, each one of us are going to focus on something else on the event. Same event, 10 different perspectives. We may get as many as 10 different views of the details of the event. And some of you will leave some things out, and some of you will put some things in. I, of course, will get all the elements correct.
I was just thinking that.
Thank you. So there is no one right. My point in that is that there is no one right perspective that captures all of the details in the event. There are 10 different reports of the event in our theoretical exercise. Here, there's one event. Greatest event in human history, by the way. I don't know if I told you that. Greatest event in human history. God comes into the world. And he has followers. And they have, as many followers have different perspectives on the event, but 4 documented. 2 are eyewitness accounts. 2 are events that are written by secondhand accounts. Okay? So Matthew was there, he saw it. And he's writing what he saw. That's important, actually, because the theories here, for example, say in 2-document theory that Mark was the first gospel written and Matthew copied it. Matthew was there, John Mark was not. Mark was writing Peter's gospel, and Luke was writing Paul's account of the message. So they're not direct eyewitnesses, they're indirect witnesses. John's a direct witness of the accounts. Right?
Yeah. Sure. John was half brother, of course he had.
So if you were there, you would likely not copy from somebody who wasn't there. Right? So that's just the first element. But we have 4 witnesses to the event. 2 are direct, 2 are indirect. Those are the Gospels that we have. Okay? So let's explore that a little bit more. How can we know? That's the question before us. So you're sitting here, you're going, wait a minute. I've put my faith in Christianity, and you told me the Scripture's the inerrant Word of God. And so now you're telling me we're not sure how we got it, right? Well, one of the things we do know is we have the early church fathers. So these are the disciples and the disciples of the disciples. They are the ones who come after the disciples. And they actually receive the text. They receive the events. And if you think about Christianity in a timeline, that's what we do. We're given the account and we pass the account on. We're given the account and we share the account and pass it on. And we're told to do that faithfully without changing literally a jot or a tittle, one word, right? And so the text itself isn't changing now because we have the ancient manuscripts, but the early church fathers had a much closer view of this. They were talking to the disciples, or they were talking to somebody who talked to the disciples. So there's a chain link that's built to the late first century, to the early second century. So the first 100 years, the disciples live up until 60 or 70 AD. John lives to as long as 90 to 100. And then the disciples of the disciples are living into the second half of the first century, into the second century, the hundreds. And they're receiving that account. So here's Eusebius, and he says, he's quoting Origen. So you see the dates. Notice the dates. We're moving backwards towards the event. So he is 3rd century, and Origen 2nd century. And these are the disciples of the disciples. They're passing down. They're receiving the messaging. And here's what they say. Among the 4 Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the church of God under heaven, I've learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, who was a publican, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism. He's actually a historian, by the way. It is one of his jobs. He's a historian. So a historian close to the events is telling us Matthew was first. Okay, so I have a hard time theologically being honest to say, well, I think it was 2,000 years later, I think it was Mark. When the guys closer to the event say it was Matthew. Right? And by the way, they're saying it was Matthew and there were 4. Quick question, how many Gospels are there? How many? Okay, no, how many Gospels are there? Okay, there's actually over 50 Gospels. Okay, there's only 4. I knew I'd get your attention. Actually, here's where I get kicked out. Like, okay, you're going to run me out for heretical teaching. Do you ever hear of the Gospel of Peter?
Oh, yeah.
The Gospel of Judas? The Gospel of Mary? Okay, so there are a number of Gospels. Here's the important fact. There are only 4 that are dated to the 1st century. The remaining Gospels are pseudographical. So if you wrote a book, like in 200 or 300 AD, and Christianity was starting to take off, and you wanted your book to be read, and your name was Joe, and nobody would read the Gospel of Joe. If I put the Gospel of Thomas on it, if I took the name of one of the apostles and put it on there, which is a common literary tool to do, people would read it. And so there are Gospels where the name is co-opted to the book. But we just saw here an eyewitness. There are only 4 indisputable ones that were written, but that I learned from tradition. There are only 4 indisputable ones on the Church of God. There are messages that are starting to creep in the 2nd and 3rd century that are trying to change the nature of who Christ is, particularly Gnosticism. And this belief of Gnostic views, all matters evil, God couldn't have come into the world in human form. That's all coming in, and we have these gospel messages that we now see, by the way, on the History Channel as though they are literally gospel, but they're not. They're several hundred years later, and so the dating and the record of when these gospels come in is critical. There are, yes, 50-something Gospels. There are only 4 written in the 1st century. There are only 4 written by either eyewitnesses or secondhand accounts from an eyewitness. Okay? Who wrote the Gospels and why should we read them? So, this is a disciple of John's who writes in AD 140. He says, the elder, the Apostle John, used to say this also. How cool would that be? Like you're sitting around, right? And you're talking and go, well, John used to tell me, or Peter used to tell me, right? I mean, I'd want that written down somewhere, right? So Papias says the The elder used to say this also. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that he mentioned, whether sayings or doings of Christ, not, however, in order. For he was neither a hearer nor a companion of the Lord, but afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who adapted his teachings as a necessity required, not as though he were making a compilation of the sayings of the Lord. So then Peter made no mistake writing down in this way some things as he, Peter, mentioned them, for he paid attention to this one thing, not to omit anything that he had heard, not to include any false statement. So Mark was writing down what Peter told him. He didn't add anything, and he didn't subtract anything. It's the same John Mark in the Acts of the Apostles. You'll see him get added to ministry. You'll see him get kicked off the boat and sent home, or decide to go home. You'll see Paul and Peter fight over him, and then Paul later takes him into ministry. That's the John Mark that we're talking about. Okay? So Mark was Peter's source. Justin Martyr confirms that. Luke's gospel, Irenaeus says, Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel provided by his teacher. Thus, from this, we can conclude that Luke's source was Paul. The early church fathers document the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Did you know that we could actually take the writings of the early church fathers? We can actually throw out all of the manuscript copies that we have, the copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we can reconstruct the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John through the referencing that they do. So when they're quoting them, we actually have in their writings a complete version of all the Gospels. So we have a transmission, a reliable transmission of the gospel messages, and from that we can see actually that there are sources to their writings. Now we get back to the original issue of the similarity between the three Gospels, the synoptics, meaning similar, synoptics, similar. If they have sources, why would they be copied from one another? They may have referenced each other, but they were all in different places at different times. And so they may have referenced each other, but the reality was they're trying to capture perspectives of an event. And that's how I really want us to think about this as we go through. We have four different unique perspectives of the event, the greatest event in human history of God coming into the world. So what is it about that unique perspective that we should take away from us? And more importantly, when we're reading it, what is it that we need to know about that perspective? Who's the author and who they're writing to that we should read as we read contextually into that? Right? So if we look, for example, at Matthew and Luke, two entirely different writers, two entirely different backgrounds, two entirely different audiences. They're writing to two separate groups. And if we think Luke is writing to the same Jewish population that Matthew is, we come up with a very different view of that perspective. Okay, so we're going to enter into the Gospels with the view of who the writer is, their view of the first-hand events, and what they're trying to get us to understand about those events. Fair enough? Okay, with that, we're going to conclude Lesson 2, and we will pick up in a second here.